The glint of sunrise caught on the barrel of Xavier Montgomery's Winchester as he squinted across his apple orchard, spotting movement where there shouldn't be any. Someone was stealing from him, and in Colorado territory of 1875, theft wasn't something a man could afford to let slide. The war had been over for a decade, but life remained harsh on the frontier, especially for a man trying to build something from nothing. Xavier moved silently through the morning dew, boots barely making a sound on the soft earth. 10 years working this land had taught him how to move like a shadow when needed. As he approached, he could make out a slim figure stretching upward, delicate fingers plucking his prized Arkansas black apples and placing them carefully in a worn canvas sack. "Those apples belong to me, madam," Xavier called out, his voice firm but not unkind. The woman startled, nearly falling from where she'd balanced on a lower branch. When she turned to face him, Xavier felt his breath catch. Despite the dirt smudged across her cheek and the threadbare quality of her dress, she was striking auburn hair falling in loose waves around a face that held both strength and vulnerability in equal measure. "I'm sorry," she stammered, clutching the sack to her chest. "They're not for me, they're for him." Xavier lowered his rifle slightly. "For who?" "My brother," she answered, her eyes a peculiar shade of green that reminded Xavier of spring leaves meeting his directly. "He's sick. The doctor said fruit might help his fever break." Xavier Montgomery had survived the war, lost his family to typhoid, and built this homestead with nothing but determination and 2 strong hands. He'd developed a keen sense for lies, and something told him this woman was speaking the truth. "What's your name?" he asked, fully lowering his weapon now. "Lydia. Lydia Caldwell." "Well, Miss Caldwell, stealing's still stealing, even for a good cause." He gestured toward his cabin with the barrel of his rifle. "But I reckon we can come to an arrangement." Fear flashed across her face. "I don't have money to pay you." "I wasn't asking for money," Xavier sighed, pushing back his hat. "My ma would turn in her grave if I denied medicine to someone who needs it. But those apples need picking proper, and I could use a hand around here. You work for me for a few days, and you can take what your brother needs." Lydia's shoulders relaxed slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. "You'd do that?" "I would. Now come down from there before you break your neck or damage my tree." Lydia climbed down carefully, keeping a cautious distance from Xavier as her feet touched the ground. She was tall for a woman, though still a head shorter than his 6'2" frame. "How far you have to go to reach your brother?" Xavier asked. "About 4 miles east, past Silver Creek." Xavier nodded. "Take what you've picked already for today. Come back tomorrow at dawn if we have a deal." Lydia hesitated, studying his face as if searching for deception. "Why would you help a stranger who was stealing from you?" "Because I've seen enough meanness in this world to last several lifetimes, Miss Caldwell." He gestured toward the dirt road that led away from his property. "And because those apples won't pick themselves. I'll be back tomorrow," she promised, clutching the small sack of apples. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery." "Xavier Montgomery." "Mr. Montgomery." She nodded once, then turned and hurried down the path, her skirts gathered in one hand to keep from tripping. Xavier watched her go, wondering what circumstances had driven a clearly educated woman to steal fruit from a stranger's orchard. There was a story there, and despite his better judgment, he found himself curious to learn it. He spent the rest of the day tending to his usual chores, feeding livestock, mending a section of fence that had come loose in the last storm, and checking his irrigation channels. All the while, his thoughts drifted to Lydia Caldwell and her sick brother. Colorado territory could be unforgiving to those without resources or connections. When dawn broke the next day, Xavier had already been up for an hour, putting coffee on to boil and frying up salt pork with the last of his cornmeal. He wasn't expecting company for breakfast, but his mother had taught him that offering food was the first step in any proper hospitality. To his mild surprise, just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, he spotted Lydia making her way up the path. She wore the same dress as yesterday, but her hair was neatly braided, and she appeared to have washed her face. Despite the early hour, she walked with purpose, determination in every step. "Morning, Miss Caldwell," Xavier called from his porch. Lydia stopped at the edge of his property, as if uncertain whether to proceed further. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery. Coffee's hot if you'd care for some." He gestured to the pot on his small table. "And there's food." She approached cautiously. "That's kind of you, but I came to work, not to impose." "Eating breakfast isn't imposing, it's common sense. Can't work well on an empty stomach." He poured a cup of the strong black coffee and held it out to her. "How's your brother this morning?" Something flickered across her face. Relief, perhaps. "Better. The fever broke during the night." "Glad to hear it." Xavier nodded toward the steaming mug. "Coffee's getting cold." Lydia finally accepted the cup, though she remained standing. "Thank you." Xavier served up a plate of the fried pork and cornmeal cakes, setting it on the table before taking his own seat. "The orchard needs tending, like I mentioned. Got about 24 trees that are ready for harvest. After that, there's mending to be done on the chicken coop, and my vegetable garden could use weeding." Lydia took a cautious sip of the coffee. "I can handle all of that." "Good." Xavier studied her over the rim of his cup. "What brings you and your brother to these parts, if you don't mind my asking?" "We're heading to San Francisco," she answered after a moment's hesitation. "My brother has a prospect there." It was vague enough that Xavier knew she was holding something back, but he didn't press. Everyone on the frontier had secrets, himself included. "San Francisco's a long way off," he observed. "Yes." She finally took a seat at the table's edge. "We plan to continue once William recovered." "So it's just the two of you, then?" Lydia nodded, taking a small bite of the cornmeal cake. "Our parents died 3 years ago. Influenza." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Lost my own family to typhoid in '67. Parents and 2 younger sisters." Lydia's eyes softened slightly. "That must have been difficult." "It was." Xavier finished his coffee in one long swallow. "Life goes on, though, whether we're ready for it or not." They finished breakfast in companionable silence. When the last bites were eaten, Xavier showed Lydia to the orchard and demonstrated the proper way to harvest the apples without damaging the fruit or the branches. "The trick is to twist, not pull," he explained, deftly removing an apple and placing it in the wooden basket at his feet. "These will fetch a good price in town if they're not bruised." Lydia proved to be a quick study and a hard worker. By midday, they had filled 6 baskets between them, and Xavier called for a rest. "You've done this before," he observed, offering her the canteen of water he'd brought along. Lydia accepted it gratefully. "My father had a small orchard back in Ohio. Nothing like this, just a few trees, but I helped with the harvesting every fall." "Ohio's a long way from Colorado." "Yes." She handed the canteen back. "After our parents died, there wasn't much reason to stay." William always dreamed of seeing the Pacific. Xavier nodded, understanding the pull of new horizons. He'd felt it himself after the war, when returning to Tennessee had meant facing too many ghosts. "How did you come to have an orchard out here?" Lydia asked, shifting the conversation away from herself. "Most folks I've seen in these parts focus on cattle or mining. Learned about fruit trees during the war, believe it or not. Was stationed for a time near an old Virginia plantation. The owner taught me the basics while I was recovering from a bullet wound." Xavier gestured to the trees around them. "Started with just 5 saplings when I claimed this land. Took years before they produced anything worth selling, but now they're my main income." "It's impressive," Lydia said, and there was genuine admiration in her voice. "To build something like this from nothing." "Wasn't nothing. Had my army pension to start, and plenty of stubborn foolishness." Xavier allowed himself a small smile. "But thank you all the same." They worked through the afternoon, and by the time the sun began to dip toward the western mountains, they had cleared nearly half the orchard. Xavier was impressed by Lydia's endurance. She never complained, even when he noticed her hands beginning to redden from the work. "That's enough for today," he said finally. "You should get back to your brother before dark." Lydia straightened, pushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "What about the chicken coop?" "It'll wait for tomorrow." Xavier filled a small sack with the finest apples they'd picked. "Take these for your brother. And here." He pulled $2 silver from his pocket. "For today's work." Lydia stared at the coins, then at him. "That's too much for one day." "It's fair pay for fair work." He pressed the money into her palm. "I don't shortchange those who earn their keep." She closed her fingers around the coins, gratitude evident in her expression. "I'll be back at dawn tomorrow. I'll have breakfast waiting." Lydia returned every morning for the next 5 days. Each day, she arrived at first light, worked diligently through the heat, and departed with payment and a selection of apples or vegetables from Xavier's garden. They developed a rhythm, working side by side, conversation flowing more easily with each passing day. Xavier learned that Lydia was 23, had been engaged once before her parents' deaths but had broken it off when her fiancé objected to her caring for her brother. She was well read, with a particular fondness for poetry, and could calculate figures in her head faster than most men Xavier had known. For her part, Lydia discovered that Xavier had fought for the Union despite his Tennessee upbringing, had once dreamed of becoming a schoolteacher before the war changed his path, and possessed an unexpected talent for woodcarving, evidenced by the intricately decorated furniture in his cabin. On the 6th day, Lydia arrived later than usual, the sun already well above the horizon when she made her way up the path. Xavier, who had begun to worry, felt relief wash over him when he spotted her approaching. "Beginning to think you decided the work wasn't worth the pay," he called out, trying to keep his tone light. As she drew closer, Xavier could see that something was wrong. Her face was pale, her movements stiff. "William's fever returned during the night," she explained, fatigue evident in her voice. "I couldn't leave until the neighbor agreed to look in on him." "You should have stayed with him," Xavier said, concern replacing his earlier relief. "The orchard would have waited. We need the money." The simple statement contained volumes of worry and responsibility. Xavier studied her for a moment, coming to a decision. "Get in the wagon." "What?" "We're going to check on your brother. I've got some willow bark that might help with the fever, and I'm bringing the rest of those apples." No arguments. To his surprise, Lydia didn't protest. She simply nodded, the gesture conveying both gratitude and resignation. Xavier hitched his wagon in record time, loading it with a basket of apples, several jars of preserved vegetables, and the medical supplies he kept on hand. When Lydia climbed up beside him, he noticed a slight tremor in her hands. "Which way?" he asked, snapping the reins. "East on the main road, then north at Silver Creek. There's a small cabin near the aspen grove." Xavier guided the horses at a steady pace, aware of Lydia's growing anxiety as they approached their destination. When they finally pulled up to a dilapidated cabin partially hidden among the trees, he understood some of her reluctance to accept help. The place was barely standing, roof sagging in one corner, windows patched with canvas instead of glass, chimney leaning at a precarious angle. It wasn't a home. It was temporary shelter at best. "You've been living here?" he asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Lydia's chin lifted slightly. "We've stayed in worse." Xavier didn't doubt it, but the thought of her spending nights in this ramshackle structure made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. Inside, the cabin was clean but sparse. A single mattress occupied one corner, where a young man lay beneath a threadbare blanket. Despite his evident illness, the family resemblance was clear, the same auburn hair, though his was darker, and similar features, though more angular than Lydia's softer countenance. "Lydia?" The young man's voice was weak, his eyes glassy with fever when they opened. "Who's that with you?" "This is Mr. Montgomery, William. He's brought some medicine that might help." Lydia moved quickly to her brother's side, pressing a hand to his forehead. "You're burning up again." Xavier hung back, taking in the rest of the cabin. A small table with one chair, a trunk that likely contained their possessions, and a tiny cookstove were the only other furnishings. No food was visible, and the water bucket in the corner was nearly empty. "Miss Caldwell, if you'll prepare some hot water, I'll mix up the willow bark tea," Xavier said, keeping his tone matter-of-fact. "And I've brought some broth that might help keep his strength up." For the next hour, Xavier worked alongside Lydia to bring William's fever down. The young man couldn't be more than 20, Xavier guessed, and though illness had clearly taken a toll, there was a resemblance to Lydia in his determined expression when he tried to sit up to drink the medicinal tea. "You didn't tell me you were working for someone," William said to his sister, voice hoarse but reproachful. "It didn't seem important," Lydia replied, adjusting his pillow. "Mr. Montgomery has been very fair. We don't need charity," William insisted, though the effect was somewhat undermined by his weakened state. "It's not charity," Xavier interjected. "Your sister has earned every penny and then some. Best worker I've had in years." William studied Xavier with suspicious eyes before a coughing fit overtook him. When it subsided, he seemed too exhausted to maintain his objections. "The fever should break again by evening if the willow bark does its job," Xavier said, standing. "But this cabin isn't helping matters. It's too damp in here, and that roof's likely to leak with the next rain." "We'll manage," Lydia said quietly. Xavier shook his head. "I've got a proposition for you both. My place has a second bedroom. It's small, but it's dry and clean. William would recover faster there, and you wouldn't have to travel back and forth each day, Miss Caldwell." Lydia's eyes widened. "That's very generous, but it's practical," Xavier corrected. "I need help through the harvest season, which is another 6 weeks at least. Having you both at the homestead means more gets done, and your brother gets well faster." "No." William's voice was weak but determined. "We can't impose like that." "It's not imposing if I'm offering," Xavier countered. "And if it makes you feel better, you can help with the bookkeeping once you're recovered. I'm terrible with numbers." Lydia and William exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Finally, Lydia turned back to Xavier. "We accept your offer, Mr. Montgomery, but only until William is well enough to travel again." "Fair enough." Xavier nodded, relieved. He couldn't in good conscience leave them in this drafty cabin, especially with William's condition. "We'll gather your things and head back before nightfall." It didn't take long to pack the Caldwells' meager possessions. William protested being carried to the wagon, but his legs gave out after just 2 steps, forcing him to accept Xavier's assistance. By the time they had him settled in the back, cushioned with blankets and protected from the sun by a canvas awning, exhaustion had overtaken his pride, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. As Xavier helped Lydia onto the wagon seat, he noticed tears glistening in her eyes. "He'll be all right," Xavier assured her. "He's young and strong." "It's not just that," Lydia said softly. "It's been a long time since anyone showed us kindness without expecting something in return." Xavier didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply clicked his tongue at the horses and set them on the road back to his homestead. The journey passed in companionable silence, broken only by William's occasional coughing from the back of the wagon. As they approached Xavier's property, he caught Lydia studying the place with new eyes, taking in the sturdy cabin, the well-maintained barn, the neat rows of the vegetable garden, and the expansive orchard stretching up the gentle slope behind the buildings. "It's not much," Xavier said, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "But it's home." "It's beautiful," Lydia replied with genuine admiration. "You've built something special here." Xavier felt an unexpected warmth at her praise. It had been a long time since anyone had seen his homestead as anything other than a remote plot of land far from civilization. Getting William settled in the small second bedroom took priority. Xavier had built the room years ago, harboring some vague notion of family that had never materialized. The bed needed fresh linens, which Lydia insisted on helping with despite her obvious exhaustion. "You should rest too," Xavier told her as they finished making the bed. You've been up since before dawn, and worrying takes its own toll. I'm fine, Lydia protested, though the dark circles beneath her eyes told a different story. Stubborn woman, Xavier muttered, though there was no heat in the words. At least sit while I make us something to eat. To his surprise, she complied, sinking into a chair at his kitchen table while he busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans, bacon, and the last of his sourdough bread. As he worked, he became acutely aware of her presence in his home, the soft sound of her breathing, the rustle of fabric as she shifted in her seat, the faint floral scent that somehow persisted despite days of physical labor. It had been years since a woman had sat at his table. The realization made him fumble the coffee pot, nearly spilling the hot liquid across the stove. Are you all right? Lydia asked. Fine, Xavier replied gruffly. Just clumsy today. They ate in silence, both too tired for conversation. After the meal, Xavier showed Lydia where she would sleep on a cot he set up in the main room, near enough to William's door that she could hear if he called out in the night, but with a screen he'd fashioned years ago for just such a circumstance, providing some privacy. Thank you, Lydia said quietly as he prepared to leave her to rest. For everything. Xavier nodded awkwardly, suddenly aware of how intimate his small cabin felt with her standing there in the soft glow of the lamplight. Get some sleep, Miss Caldwell. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out what comes next. He retreated to his own room, but sleep proved elusive. The knowledge that Lydia was just beyond his door, that his solitary existence had been interrupted so thoroughly and unexpectedly, kept his mind racing long into the night. The following days established a new routine. William's condition improved steadily with proper rest, nutrition, and the medicinal teas Xavier prepared from his herb garden. Lydia divided her time between caring for her brother and helping Xavier with the ongoing harvest, insisting that she continue to earn her keep. A week after the Caldwells moved into his home, Xavier returned from town with supplies and an unexpected addition: a second chair for his table. Found it at the Mercantile, he explained when Lydia raised an eyebrow at the furniture. Figured it made more sense than us taking turns standing during meals. She smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed her face and caused Xavier's heart to perform an unfamiliar stutter. Very practical of you, Mr. Montgomery. Xavier, he corrected, the words escaping before he could reconsider. If we're sharing a home, even temporarily, perhaps we could dispense with formalities. Lydia considered this for a moment. Xavier, then, she said finally, testing the name. And you may call me Lydia if you wish. Lydia, he repeated, liking the way it felt on his tongue. How's your brother doing today? Better. He managed to sit up for nearly an hour this morning, and his appetite is returning. Good. That's good. Xavier busied himself unloading the supplies, acutely aware of Lydia watching him. I picked up a few books from the lending library. Thought they might help pass the time while he recovers. Lydia's expression softened. That was thoughtful of you. Xavier shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Just practical. Boredom can be as bad as illness sometimes. That evening, for the first time, William joined them at the table for dinner. Still weak but clearly improving, he watched Xavier with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion that reminded Xavier of wary young recruits he'd known during the war. Mr. Montgomery, Xavier. Lydia corrected gently. William's eyebrows rose slightly, but he continued. Xavier, then. I want to thank you for your hospitality. Not many would take in strangers the way you have. No need for thanks, Xavier replied, uncomfortable with the formal acknowledgement. You'll earn your keep once you're well, like your sister said. About that. William straightened in his chair, wincing slightly at the effort. Lydia mentioned you keep books for your orchard business. I studied accounting for a time back east. I'd be happy to review your ledgers, perhaps suggest some improvements to your system. Xavier considered this. His bookkeeping consisted mainly of scrawled notes in a leather-bound journal, hardly a system at all. I'd appreciate that, he said finally. Never was much good with numbers beyond the basics. William relaxed slightly, seeming pleased to have something concrete to offer in exchange for Xavier's help. The conversation flowed more easily after that, with William revealing a dry wit that complemented his sister's more reserved humor. As the days passed, a comfortable rhythm developed among the three of them. William gained strength daily, eventually moving from the bedroom to a chair on the porch where he could enjoy the autumn sunshine while reviewing Xavier's rudimentary accounts. Lydia continued to help with the harvest, her capable hands now as familiar with Xavier's orchard as his own. In the evenings, they would gather in the main room of the cabin. Sometimes they read from the books Xavier had borrowed. Lydia had a gift for bringing stories to life with her voice, and other times they simply talked, sharing pieces of their pasts and present thoughts as the fire crackled in the hearth. Xavier found himself looking forward to these quiet evenings more than he cared to admit. Somewhere along the way, the Caldwells had ceased to be temporary guests, and had become something dangerously close to family. It was William who first broached the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them for weeks. "Winter will be here soon," he observed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Lydia had gone to the root cellar to fetch vegetables for dinner, leaving the two men alone. Xavier nodded, knowing what was coming. "Another month, maybe less, before the first snow. We should be on our way before then," William said, his voice carefully neutral. "The passes to California will become treacherous." "They will," Xavier agreed, feeling a weight settle in his chest. "Though you're welcome to winter here if you prefer. Spring travel has its advantages." William studied him for a long moment. "That's generous, but I suspect your offer has more to do with my sister than with practical considerations for travel." Xavier's head snapped up, protest forming on his lips, but William held up a hand. "I'm not blind, Xavier. I've seen how you look at her when you think no one's watching." Heat crept up Xavier's neck. "I haven't acted improperly." "No, you haven't," William acknowledged. "But intentions have a way of making themselves known, even when unspoken." Xavier fell silent, unable to deny what William had so accurately perceived. The truth was, the thought of Lydia leaving had become increasingly painful as the weeks passed. He'd found himself inventing reasons why their departure should be delayed: another section of orchard that needed attention, repairs to the root cellar that required an extra pair of hands, a new batch of preserves that would be easier with Lydia's help. "I don't know what you expect me to say," Xavier finally replied. "Nothing," William said simply. "But I'd ask that you be honest with yourself and with her before we make any decisions about leaving." The conversation was cut short by Lydia's return, her arms full of potatoes and carrots for the stew she planned to make. If she noticed the tension between the two men, she gave no indication, instead chatting cheerfully about her plans to experiment with a new recipe she'd found in one of Xavier's mother's old cookbooks. That night Xavier lay awake, William's words echoing in his mind. Be honest with yourself and with her. The problem was, Xavier wasn't entirely sure what honesty looked like in this situation. He'd lived alone for so long that the presence of others in his home, in his life, had upended everything he thought he knew about himself. What he did know was that the thought of returning to his solitary existence after Lydia and William departed left him hollow inside. Somehow, in the span of a few short weeks, his carefully constructed life had been rearranged around their presence. The next day dawned clear and cool, a hint of winter in the crisp air. Xavier rose early as usual, but instead of immediately starting his chores, he sat at his table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper. If he was going to be honest, as William had suggested, he needed to organize his thoughts first. By the time Lydia emerged from behind her screen, hair neatly braided and ready for the day's work, Xavier had filled the page with his cramped handwriting and then folded it away in his pocket, still uncertain what, if anything, he would say to her. "You're still here," Lydia observed, surprise evident in her voice. "I thought you'd be halfway through morning chores by now." "Thought I'd wait and have breakfast with you," Xavier replied, pouring her a cup of coffee. "If that's all right." "Of course." She accepted the cup with a smile that made his heart perform that now familiar skip. Though I have to wonder if you're feeling well. You're usually impatient to start the day's work. Just thinking, Xavier said, standing to retrieve the oatmeal he'd set to simmer on the stove. Your brother mentioned yesterday that you'll need to leave soon if you're to cross the mountains before winter. Something flickered across Lydia's face. Disappointment? Resignation? It was gone too quickly for Xavier to be certain. Yes, she agreed, focusing on her coffee. We've imposed on your hospitality far longer than we intended. It's not an imposition, Xavier said quickly, perhaps too quickly based on the way Lydia's eyes widened slightly. He cleared his throat. What I mean is, you've both more than earned your keep. The orchard's in better shape than it's ever been, and William's work on my accounts has already saved me money I didn't know I was losing. That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness, it's truth. Xavier served the oatmeal, buying himself a moment to gather his thoughts. What I'm trying to say, not very well, is that you don't need to rush your departure on my account. Lydia studied him, her green eyes thoughtful. William seems eager to continue our journey. He's been talking about San Francisco more frequently these past few days. And you? Xavier asked, the question that had been burning in his mind finally escaping. Are you eager to reach California? Lydia's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She set the spoon down carefully. I've never been one to put much stock in dreams of golden opportunities. I agreed to the journey because William needed a fresh start after our parents died, and there was nothing keeping us in Ohio. And now? She met his gaze directly. Now I find myself reluctant to leave a place for the first time since we set out. The admission hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Xavier's heart pounded in his chest as he considered his next words carefully. I'd like you to stay, he said finally, the simple truth of it almost a relief to speak aloud. Both of you, if that's what it takes. The orchard's more successful than it's ever been, and there's more than enough work year-round to justify the arrangement. Lydia's expression was unreadable. As employees, you mean? To start with, Xavier admitted. But I hope. That is, I've come to. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I'm not good with words, Lydia. Never have been. But these weeks with you here have been the happiest I've known in years, maybe ever. A flush crept into Lydia's cheeks. Xavier, you don't need to say anything now. He hurried on. I know this is sudden, and there's William to consider. I just wanted you to know that there's a place for you here, if you want it. Whatever form that might take. Lydia looked down at her bowl, then back up at him, a mixture of emotions playing across her features. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Xavier assured her. Just think about it. Before you and William make your final decision. She nodded slowly. I will. The rest of breakfast passed in somewhat awkward silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When William emerged from his room, he seemed to sense the tension immediately, his gaze moving between them with undisguised curiosity. Did I miss something? He asked, accepting the bowl of oatmeal Lydia prepared for him. Just discussing winter preparations, Xavier replied, standing. I should get to the orchard. Those last trees won't harvest themselves. He escaped to the familiar routine of his work, grateful for the physical exertion that kept his mind from dwelling too much on the conversation with Lydia. He'd said his piece, clumsy as it was. Now it was up to her. The day passed slowly, with Xavier deliberately working the farthest section of the orchard to give Lydia space. It wasn't until late afternoon, as he was loading the last of the day's harvest onto a wagon, that he heard footsteps approaching. Need a hand? William asked, joining him at the wagon. Xavier straightened, surprised to see the younger man so far from the cabin. Should you be walking this far? William smiled wryly. I'm not an invalid anymore, though my sister still treats me like one sometimes. He picked up an apple, examining it with appreciation. You've built something remarkable here, Xavier. Thank you, Xavier replied, uncertain where this conversation was heading. Lydia told me about your offer. William continued, setting the apple carefully in the wagon. For us to stay on. Xavier tensed. Did she? She did. William leaned against the wagon, his expression serious. I've had my heart set on California for so long that I never stopped to consider whether it was still the right destination for us. For Lydia. And now? Now I'm wondering if my sister hasn't already found what I've been chasing halfway across the country. Xavier's breath caught. What are you saying, William? I'm saying that I've watched my sister smile more in these weeks on your homestead than she has in the 3 years since our parents died. William pushed away from the wagon, facing Xavier directly. And I'm saying that if your intentions toward her are honorable, I won't stand in the way of her happiness. They are, Xavier said immediately. Honorable, I mean. William nodded, satisfied. Good. Because while I may be her younger brother, I'm still the only family she has. Her happiness matters to me more than any dream of California. Have you discussed this with her? Xavier asked, hope beginning to stir despite his efforts to temper it. Not directly, William admitted. But I know my sister. She's torn between her loyalty to me and what I suspect are growing feelings for you. He smiled slightly. She's always put others before herself. Perhaps it's time someone put her first. Xavier considered this. What about you? Would you be content to stay here if she chose to? I think I could be, William said thoughtfully. This is good land, with potential beyond just the orchard. And I've developed a certain fondness for the mountains. He grinned suddenly. Besides, there's a rather pretty young lady at the Mercantile in town who seems interested in improving my acquaintance. Xavier couldn't help but laugh. Hannah Miller? She's a good woman from a respected family. So I've gathered, William replied, a hint of color in his cheeks. All the more reason to consider extending our stay, wouldn't you say? As the two men walked back to the cabin together, Xavier felt a lightness in his chest that had been absent for longer than he could remember. Nothing was settled yet, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't solitary. Lydia was waiting on the porch when they returned, her expression anxious as she took in the sight of them walking side by side. William! You shouldn't be exerting yourself, she chided, though her tone lacked conviction. I'm fine, Lydia, William assured her. Better than fine, actually. Xavier and I had a good talk. Her eyes darted to Xavier, questioning. Did you? We did, Xavier confirmed, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. About the future. Yours, his, mine. I see. Lydia's fingers twisted in her apron, a rare show of nervousness. And what conclusions did you reach? William smiled at his sister. That perhaps we've been looking for home in the wrong direction. He patted her shoulder gently. I think I'll turn in early. Long walk today. With a meaningful glance at Xavier, he disappeared into the cabin, leaving them alone on the porch. Silence stretched between them, either quite knowing how to begin. Finally, Xavier cleared his throat. I meant what I said this morning, he said quietly. I'd like you to stay. Both of you, if that's what you want. Lydia took a deep breath. And if what I want is more than just employment? Xavier's heart hammered against his ribs. Then I'd say we want the same thing. I've only known you a few weeks, Lydia said, though she took a step closer to him. Some would say that's not long enough to make such decisions. Some would, Xavier agreed. But I've learned to trust my instincts, and everything in me says that letting you leave would be the biggest mistake of my life. A smile tugged at the corner of Lydia's mouth. For a man who claims not to be good with words, you can be quite persuasive when you try. Xavier reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. I'm not offering poetry or grand promises, Lydia. Just myself and this place, for as long as you'll have them. When I was stealing your apples that first day, Lydia said softly, her fingers curling around his, I never imagined it would lead to this moment. Nor did I, Xavier admitted. But I'm grateful for your thievery all the same. Lydia laughed, the sound bright in the evening air. So am I. there in the fading light, with the scent of apples surrounding them and the mountains standing witness, Xavier Montgomery kissed Lydia Caldwell for the first time. It was a gentle kiss, full of promise and possibility, and when they parted, both were smiling. "Stay," Xavier whispered against her hair. "Not as my employee or even as my guest. Stay and see what we might build together." "Yes," Lydia answered simply. "I'll stay." Winter came to the Colorado Territory with its usual ferocity, but inside Xavier Montgomery's cabin, warmth and light prevailed. The orchard rested beneath a blanket of snow, the trees dormant until spring would awaken them once more. Inside, life continued to unfold in new and unexpected ways. William had indeed extended his acquaintance with Hannah Miller, spending more time in town as the weather allowed. Xavier suspected there would be another wedding before the year was out, but he kept that thought to himself for now. As for Xavier and Lydia, they were married by the circuit preacher just before the first heavy snowfall, in a simple ceremony attended by William, Hannah and her family, and a few of Xavier's closest neighbors. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful, with music and dancing continuing well into the evening. Now, as Xavier watched his wife moving about their kitchen, preparing breakfast while humming softly to herself, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed in the span of a few short months. The solitude he had once thought essential had given way to partnership, to shared joys and challenges, to a future brighter than he had dared to imagine. "What are you thinking about so intently?" Lydia asked, catching him watching her. Xavier smiled, rising from his chair to join her by the stove. "Just that I'm the luckiest man in Colorado Territory." "Because your wife makes excellent biscuits?" she teased, gesturing to the golden rounds cooling on the counter. "Because my wife is excellent in all things," he corrected, drawing her into his arms. "Including her taste in husbands." Lydia laughed, the sound still a delight to his ears. "I can't argue with that." Outside, snow began to fall again, adding to the drifts that surrounded their home. But inside, in the warmth of their kitchen, with the scent of coffee and biscuits mingling in the air, Xavier and Lydia Montgomery stood together, grateful for stolen apples, second chances, and the unexpected path that had led them home to each other. Spring arrived with its usual explosion of new life, transforming the landscape from white to vibrant green almost overnight. The orchard burst into bloom, thousands of white and pink blossoms promising a bountiful harvest come fall. Xavier and Lydia worked side by side to prepare the vegetable garden, turning the soil and planting the seeds that would sustain them through another year. William, who had indeed proposed to Hannah Miller during the winter, split his time between the orchard and town, where he had taken a position keeping books for Hannah's father's mercantile. "I've been thinking," Xavier said one afternoon as he and Lydia took a rare moment of rest beneath the shade of a flowering apple tree. "About expanding." Lydia raised an eyebrow. "The orchard? I thought we agreed to wait until next year to plant more trees." "Not the orchard," Xavier clarified, taking her hand in his. "The house." Understanding dawned in Lydia's eyes. "Oh? It was built for one, expanded hastily for two, and now with William and Hannah likely to visit often." Xavier hesitated, then continued. "And perhaps, if we're fortunate, there might be more than just the two of us to consider in the future." Lydia's free hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, a gesture that sent hope coursing through Xavier. "That's a fine idea," she said softly. "Though I think we might need to consider the expansion sooner rather than later." Xavier's breath caught. "Lydia? Are you saying?" She nodded, a mixture of joy and nervousness in her expression. "Dr. Pearson confirmed it last week when I went into town. Come winter, there will be another Montgomery in this house." Xavier whooped with joy, lifting Lydia gently off her feet and spinning her in a circle before setting her carefully back on the ground. "A baby," he said in wonder. "Our baby. Our baby," Lydia confirmed, her eyes shining. "Though I must warn you, my mother always said Caldwell women tend to have girls. A daughter would be perfect," Xavier declared. "With your eyes and your spirit. And your kindness," Lydia added, touching his cheek gently. Your generosity. Xavier covered her hand with his own. I love you, Lydia Montgomery. More than I ever thought possible. And I love you, she replied. My apple thief catcher. Xavier laughed. I believe I caught more than a thief that day. Indeed you did, Lydia agreed, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. You caught a family. As they walked hand in hand back toward the house they would soon expand, Xavier reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led him here. From solitary orchard keeper to husband and father-to-be in less than a year. All because a desperate woman had stolen apples from his tree, not for herself, but for someone she loved. Life in the Colorado Territory remained challenging, with harsh winters and the ever-present frontier difficulties. But now Xavier faced those challenges with Lydia by his side, their love a constant amidst life's uncertainties. Together they had built something precious on this land, not just an orchard or a home, but a life filled with purpose and belonging. And it had all begun with stolen apples and an act of compassion that neither of them could have known would change their lives forever. 5 years later, the Montgomery orchard had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. The apple trees, now mature and productive, yielded fruit that was sought after as far away as Denver and beyond. The modest cabin had been transformed into a proper farmhouse, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides and enough rooms to accommodate their growing family. On a warm autumn afternoon, Xavier stood at the edge of the orchard, watching as his 4-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, carefully placed apples into a basket under her mother's supervision. With her auburn hair and determined expression, she was the image of Lydia, though Xavier often claimed she had inherited his stubborn nature. Papa! Elizabeth called, spotting him. Look how many I picked! Xavier crossed to them, crouching down to admire his daughter's work. That's impressive, Lizzie. You're becoming quite the orchard girl. Like Mama, Elizabeth said proudly. Even better than Mama, Lydia added with a smile. I was much older before I learned to pick apples properly. Xavier exchanged a knowing look with his wife, both remembering the circumstances of their first meeting. Those memories now brought smiles rather than embarrassment, having become part of the family lore they would pass down through generations. A cry from the porch drew their attention to where William's wife Hannah sat with their infant son and the Montgomerys' own 6-month-old son, James. William had built a home of his own just a half-mile down the road, close enough for the families to support each other while maintaining their independence. Sounds like James is awake from his nap, Lydia observed. I should go to him. I'll take over here with our master apple picker, Xavier offered. We have the north section to finish before dinner. Lydia kissed him quickly before heading toward the house, pausing to chat with Hannah on the porch. Xavier watched her go, still sometimes amazed by the turn his life had taken. Papa, Elizabeth said seriously, tugging at his hand. Uncle William says the apples are magic. Is that true? Xavier lifted his daughter into his arms. Why would he say that? He said they brought you and Mama together, Elizabeth explained. And that's why we have to take special care of the trees. Xavier smiled, carrying Elizabeth deeper into the orchard. Your Uncle William is right about that. These trees are special to our family. Tell me the story again, Elizabeth pleaded as they reached the next tree. About how you caught Mama stealing. It was a story she had heard dozens of times, but never seemed to tire of. Xavier set her down gently and handed her a small cloth bag for collecting fallen fruit. Well, he began, the familiar tale flowing easily. It was a morning much like this one, crisp and bright. I was walking through the orchard when I spotted someone helping themselves to my finest Arkansas black apples. As he spoke, Xavier looked out over the land that had once been just a solitary homestead and was now the heart of a family. The original apple trees, the ones Lydia had been caught stealing from, still stood proudly at the center of the orchard, their branches heavy with fruit each year as if commemorating the unlikely beginning of the Montgomery family. Later that evening, with the children asleep and William and Hannah returned to their own home, Xavier and Lydia sat together on their porch, watching as the last light faded from the sky. Lydia's head rested against his shoulder, her hand entwined with his. "I received a letter from my friend Caroline in Ohio today," Lydia said quietly. "She wrote that she always wondered what became of the Caldwell siblings who set off for California and never arrived." Xavier chuckled. "Little did she know you'd be sidetracked by an apple orchard in Colorado." "The best detour of my life," Lydia replied, squeezing his hand. "Though I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been caught that day." "You would have taken your apples and disappeared," Xavier mused. "And I would still be here alone, none the wiser about what I was missing." "I'm glad you caught me," Lydia said softly. Xavier turned to kiss her, still marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "So am I, my love. So am I." As darkness settled fully around them, they remained on the porch, two people who had found in each other not just love, but home. The orchard stretched before them, a legacy they would pass to their children, along with the story of how a desperate act of theft had led to the greatest blessing of their lives. For Xavier and Lydia Montgomery, what had begun with stolen apples had blossomed into a life more abundant and sweet than either could have imagined, a testament to the unexpected ways love could take root and flourish, even in the wild heart of the frontier.